The smoke never lies. It rolls across the field in great gray walls, swallowing men whole, erasing regiments in seconds. And somewhere inside that smoke, standing on a ridge overlooking the ruins of everything he had ever built, was the most powerful man the world had ever seen. His coat was muddy. His hands were trembling. Around him, the greatest army in Europe was not retreating. It was dissolving. Thousands of men throwing down their rifles, their flags, their dignity, and running into the dark like frightened animals. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, conqueror of nations, the man who had made kings beg and generals weep, standing in the mud of a Belgian field, watching it all end. How does a man like that fall? Not slowly, not quietly, not with dignity. In a single day, in a single battle. In the span of a few catastrophic hours, the greatest military mind in history walked into a trap he never saw coming, made mistakes he should have known better than to make, and lost everything. His empire, his army, his legend, on a patch of ground near a village called Waterloo. This is how it happened. To understand what was lost at Waterloo, you first have to understand what Napoleon Bonaparte actually was. Not the myth, not the statue, the real man, and what he had actually done. He was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, the son of a minor noble family, speaking French with an accent that made Parisian aristocrats laugh. He was short, awkward, strange, a student in military school who had few friends and read everything he could find. Nobody looked at young Napoleon Bonaparte and saw the future master of Europe. But war revealed something in him that ordinary life could not. He saw the battlefield differently from every other general of his era. While other commanders moved armies like chess pieces according to rigid doctrine, Napoleon moved them like water, fluid, fast, always flowing around resistance and crashing where the enemy was weakest. He understood momentum. He understood fear. He understood that an army's spirit could be broken long before its body was destroyed. He rose through the chaos of the French Revolution, won campaigns in Italy that astonished Europe, conquered Egypt, and then seized control of France itself in a coup at the age of 30. By the time he was 35, he had declared himself emperor. By 40, he had defeated Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Spain. He had redrawn the map of Europe more times than most men changed their coats. He placed his brothers on foreign thrones. He forced emperors to sign peace treaties on his terms. He built an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Russia. The continent had never seen anything like him, and it was terrified. But empires built on conquest require endless conquest to survive. In 1812, Napoleon marched into Russia with the largest army ever assembled in Western history. 600,000 men. He reached Moscow. He found it burned and abandoned. The Russian winter arrived. The supply lines collapsed. The retreat from Moscow killed more French soldiers than any battle Napoleon had ever fought. He limped back to France with a fraction of what he had taken in. The vultures circled. The coalition formed. Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Sweden, united against him and striking hard. In 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, Napoleon suffered the greatest defeat of his career. He fought brilliantly as always, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered by enemies who had finally learned how to fight him. Paris fell. His marshals, exhausted and broken, told him the war was over. In April 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte signed his abdication. He was exiled to the island of Elba, a tiny Mediterranean rock, with a small court, a ceremonial guard, and nothing to do but think. The man who had commanded millions was now sovereign of an island 11 miles wide. He was 44 years old. He watched ships in the harbor and waited. Europe exhaled. It lasted 10 months. In February 1815, Napoleon walked out of exile as casually as a man leaving a dinner party he had grown bored of. He boarded a small flotilla of ships with 1,000 men and sailed for the French coast. The powers of Europe heard the news and initially laughed. This was the final, desperate act of a broken man. France would reject him. He would be arrested within days. He landed near Cannes on March 1st. Then something extraordinary began to happen. The French army sent to capture him marched toward him on the road south of Grenoble. Napoleon dismounted his horse, walked out alone in front of his tiny force, opened his coat, and called out to them, "If any of you wishes to shoot his emperor, here I am." There was silence. Then the soldiers broke formation. They ran, not away from him, toward him. The entire regiment crossed over to his side. Within days, the army dispatched to stop Napoleon's return had become Napoleon's army. He marched north. Town after town declared for him. Generals who had sworn loyalty to the restored Bourbon king suddenly remembered where their hearts truly lay. King Louis XVIII fled Paris in the night without even stopping to change his clothes. On March the 20th, Napoleon Bonaparte walked into the Tuileries Palace to the roar of delirious crowds, precisely as if he had simply been away on a long journey and had now returned home. He had reconquered France without firing a single shot. Europe did not laugh anymore. Within days, the major powers declared Napoleon an outlaw, an enemy of civilization itself. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia began mobilizing forces that would total over 700,000 men. They had learned their lesson. There would be no negotiation, no recognition, no peace. Napoleon Bonaparte had to be destroyed, and he had to be destroyed before his army grew too strong to stop. Napoleon understood the arithmetic. He could not fight all of them at once. Every week that passed, the coalition grew stronger and his window closed. He had approximately 120,000 men ready to fight. The Allied forces converging on France numbered far more. His only chance was to attack before they could unite, to strike into the center of the gathering storm, defeat each army separately, drive a wedge between the British under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussians under Field Marshal Blucher, and shatter the coalition's nerve before their full weight could fall on France. It was exactly the kind of bold, aggressive strategy that had made Napoleon the most feared commander in history. Attack before the enemy expects it. Move fast. Strike the seam. Win. On June 12, 1815, Napoleon left Paris. 3 days later, he crossed into Belgium at the head of the Armée du Nord, roughly 120,000 veterans, hardened soldiers who believed in him with a devotion that bordered on religious. These were not conscripts. These were men who had followed him from Cairo to Moscow and back again. The eagles were flying once more. The early strikes were promising. On June 16th, the French engaged the Prussians at Ligny. Napoleon's plan worked almost exactly as designed. The French hammered the Prussian center with relentless pressure, cracked their lines, and sent Blucher's army retreating in disorder. The old Prussian marshal himself was thrown from his horse and nearly captured, lying pinned under the animal while cavalry thundered past him. The Prussians were beaten, bloodied, forced back. That same day, to the west, Napoleon's left wing under Marshal Ney engaged the British and Allied forces at Quatre Bras, a critical crossroads that needed to be seized before Wellington could concentrate his army. Ney had the numbers. He had the position. He had the orders. He hesitated. He attacked too late, failed to take the crossroads decisively, and Wellington managed to hold long enough to stabilize his lines. A golden opportunity slipped through French fingers while it was still daylight. It was the first crack. Small enough to miss, large enough to matter. Napoleon dispatched Marshal Grouchy with 33,000 men to pursue the retreating Prussians, to hound them, harass them, keep them from recovering and rejoining Wellington. Grouchy marched. He searched. He could not quite find them. The Prussians, under the resilient and stubborn Blucher, did something unexpected. They did not retreat east toward their supply lines. They retreated north in the same direction as Wellington, keeping the two Allied armies within supporting distance of each other. Grouchy was following a ghost while the real army was already somewhere else. On the night of June 17th, Wellington pulled back to a ridge he had scouted earlier, a long, low rise of ground called Mont Saint-Jean, just south of the village of Waterloo. He had chosen this ground carefully. The ridge was wide enough to conceal the depth of his defensive line from enemy observers. In front of it lay a valley. Directly in front of his right flank stood a fortified farmhouse called Hougoumont, a fortress within a battlefield that would require the French to either take it or leave a threat festering in their side. It was good defensive ground. Wellington knew good defensive ground better than almost any general alive. The rain came that night as if the sky itself was participating in the drama. It was not ordinary rain. It fell in torrents, hour after hour, drowning campfires, soaking men to the bone, turning the fields of Belgium into a black, clinging quagmire. The roads became rivers. The low ground became swamp. The clay soil of the Waterloo Valley absorbed water until it had no room left, and then it sat there, thick and heavy, waiting to swallow artillery wheels, slow horses, and exhaust every man who had to cross it. Napoleon had planned to attack at dawn. The mud made dawn impossible. He waited. He waited until the ground dried enough for his artillery and cavalry to move effectively. He waited until mid-morning. He waited until nearly noon. He was not feeling well. Hemorrhoids, a bladder condition, possible exhaustion from the campaign. Some of his officers would later suggest he was not himself that day. Not the sharp, relentless Napoleon of Austerlitz and Jena. Others argued the delay was rational, even necessary. The ground was simply too wet. The army he was waiting to fight used those hours well. Wellington arranged his forces along the ridge with the precision of a man who had thought about this kind of battle for years. His allied army of roughly 68,000, British, Dutch, Belgian, German, held a line nearly 3 miles wide. He placed his most reliable British and German units at the critical points, his less experienced allies in more protected positions. He placed artillery along the crest. He built a defense designed not to defeat Napoleon in a single brilliant stroke, but to absorb punishment, to bleed the French attacks until there was nothing left to throw. At 35 minutes past 11 in the morning, the Battle of Waterloo began. The French opened with a diversionary assault on Hougoumont, the fortified farmhouse on Wellington's right. It was meant to pull British troops away from the center. Instead, it became something else entirely. A savage, grinding battle within a battle that consumed French soldiers by the thousands over the course of the entire day. The garrison of Hougoumont, never numbering more than a few thousand men, held against wave after wave of French attacks. The gates were nearly broken open once. A giant French officer known as the Smasher broke through a side gate with an axe before the defenders fought him back and slammed the gates shut again. Those gates held. Hougoumont held. All day. It was one of the most extraordinary defensive stands in military history, and it consumed French resources that Napoleon could not afford to waste. At 1 in the afternoon, Napoleon ordered his main assault on Wellington Center. 80 guns opened fire. A bombardment meant to shatter the British line before the infantry went in. But Wellington had pulled most of his men back just behind the ridgeline, using the slope itself as cover. The French cannonballs screamed overhead or buried themselves in the wet earth, killing far fewer men than they should have. Then the great columns of French infantry, tens of thousands of men, began their advance across the valley. They marched into a storm. Wellington brought his men forward to the crest as the French columns came up the slope, and the British volleys tore into them at close range. The French column formation that had broken armies across Europe had a critical weakness. When it met well-drilled infantry in good position, it could only bring the men in the front and on the flanks to bear, while thousands of soldiers in the column's depth stood helplessly packed together, unable to shoot, dying from fire they could not return. British musketry was disciplined, relentless, and murderous. The French columns shuddered, broke, and fell back down the slope. Napoleon sent them in again, and again. Each time the result was the same. The British line bent. It bled. It did not break. Then came the cavalry. Marshal Ney, watching the British line and misreading a routine repositioning as a retreat, made one of the most catastrophic decisions of the entire Napoleonic era. Without orders from Napoleon, without infantry support, without proper coordination, he launched the French heavy cavalry. Nearly 10,000 horsemen thundering across the valley and up the ridge toward the British position. It was a magnificent and terrible sight. The ground shook with the sound of them, but Wellington's infantry had formed squares. Tight, disciplined formations of men standing 4 ranks deep, bristling with bayonets on every side. Cavalry could not break a properly formed square. The horses would not charge into a wall of steel. They could only wheel around it, take fire from every face, and eventually retreat in chaos. The French cavalry charged the squares. The squares held. The cavalry charged again. The squares held again. The horses died. The riders died, and when the cavalry finally withdrew, exhausted and shattered, they had achieved almost nothing. The British line was still there. The afternoon was bleeding away. And to the east, something was happening that Napoleon had feared from the beginning. The Prussians were coming. Blucher, old and battered from his fall at Ligny, had refused to let his army rest. He had pushed them through the night and through the morning, driven them north and then west, along muddy roads that were barely passable, toward the sound of the guns at Waterloo. His staff had told him it was too much. He had told them it was necessary. By early afternoon, the first Prussian units were beginning to appear on Napoleon's right flank. Napoleon had known this was possible. He had counted on Grouchy to prevent it. But Grouchy was miles away, marching in the wrong direction, writing letters back to headquarters asking for clarification while the Prussian army slipped past him and moved toward the battlefield. Napoleon sent reserves to hold the Prussians back, but every soldier sent to the right was a soldier not available for the final push against Wellington. The pressure was building from two directions at once, and the day was running out. At 6 in the evening, Ney launched another assault on the British center, this time with infantry and artillery combined. The assault nearly succeeded. The farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, a fortified position in the center of the British line, finally fell to the French after hours of savage fighting. For a brief and agonizing moment, there was a gap in Wellington's center. Ney sent to Napoleon for more infantry to exploit it. Napoleon had no infantry to give. The moment passed. Wellington plugged the gap, and the last real opportunity to destroy the British army at Waterloo closed like a door. By 7 in the evening, Napoleon faced a choice that was not really a choice at all. His army was exhausted. His cavalry was destroyed. The Prussians were pressing hard on his right flank. Wellington's line was still holding. He had one card left to play: the Imperial Guard. They were the finest soldiers in Europe, the elite of the elite, veterans of 20 years of warfare, men who had fought at Austerlitz and Wagram and Borodino and survived them all. They had never been broken in battle. Their reputation alone had won engagements before a shot was fired. Napoleon had held them back all day, preserving them for exactly this moment. He sent them forward. They marched up the slope toward the British line in the gathering dusk, in their great bearskin hats, with the drums beating and the eagles carried high. The French army watching from the ridge below believed it was over. The Guard never lost. The Guard would shatter whatever remained of Wellington's line, and the battle would be won. But Wellington had anticipated this. He had placed fresh British and German infantry in positions the French could not see from the valley floor. As the Imperial Guard crested the ridge, they were met not by an exhausted and crumbling line, but by disciplined volleys fired at point-blank range from troops who had been standing in reserve for hours. The Guards stopped. They had never been stopped before. They tried to advance. The fire intensified. Men fell by the dozens, by the hundreds. The formations began to waver. And then, from the flank, more British infantry rose from the ground, where they had been lying hidden, and poured a devastating crossfire into the column. The Imperial Guard broke. The words spread across the French army like fire on dry grass. The Guard retreats. The Guard retreats. In 20 years of warfare, those words had never been spoken. They meant only one thing. All was lost. The French army did not retreat. It collapsed. Soldiers who had fought with ferocious courage all day simply dropped their weapons and ran. The carefully maintained formations dissolved in minutes. Officers screaming for order were ignored. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a panic. The Prussians, arriving in full strength now, cut into the fleeing mass with ruthless efficiency. There was no rally point, no fallback position, no reformed line. There was only the dark and the road south, and the desperate need to escape. Napoleon was swept along with the tide of his own broken army. He tried to rally them. There was nothing to rally. He rode until his horses gave out, abandoned his carriage, and continued on horseback as his guards fought off the Prussian cavalry, hunting through the dark for any man important enough to capture. By midnight, the Battle of Waterloo was over. The casualties were staggering. The French had lost somewhere between 30 and 40,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. The British and their allies had suffered roughly 15,000 dead and wounded. The Prussians nearly 7,000. In a single afternoon, one of the most destructive battles in European history had been fought, decided, and finished. Napoleon reached Paris 4 days later. He tried to organize resistance. There was none to organize. His political support had evaporated. His marshals were done. The nation that had cheered his return 3 months earlier had nothing left to give. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated for the second time. He attempted to escape to America. The British Navy was waiting. He was taken aboard HMS Bellerophon and surrendered himself to the captain, reportedly expressing admiration for the Royal Navy. He was taken to the island of St. Helena, not a pleasant Mediterranean rock like Elba. St. Helena was a remote volcanic island in the South Atlantic, nearly 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, a place specifically chosen because there was no escape from it. He lived there for 6 years. He dictated his memoirs, shaped his legend, complained about the conditions, and argued with his British jailers. He died on May 5, 1821. He was 51 years old. The cause of death was likely stomach cancer, though theories of arsenic poisoning have never been entirely dismissed. He never saw France again. Stand back from all of it and ask the question one more time. How does a man like that fall? Not through cowardice. Napoleon was never a coward. Not through lack of ability. On the morning of June 18, 1815, he was still one of the finest military minds alive. Not through lack of courage or ambition or will. He fell through accumulation, through all the small things that stacked against him and that he could not stop. The rain that delayed his attack and gave the Allied armies precious hours. The mud that slowed his artillery. The hesitation at Quatre Bras that let Wellington consolidate. The misdirected pursuit that freed the Prussians to march. The illness that dulled his edge. The cavalry charge launched without orders that wasted 10,000 horsemen for nothing. The reserves that arrived too late and in the wrong place. And underneath all of it, the simple, brutal fact that the enemies he had educated over 20 years of war had finally learned his lessons well enough to beat him. Napoleon did not lose Waterloo because he forgot how to be Napoleon. He lost it because everything that could go wrong went wrong at the same time, and because the men across the valley had grown good enough to make sure that nothing could go right. One day, one battle, one patch of wet Belgian farmland, and the most powerful empire in Europe turned to smoke. The smoke never lies. It tells you what is gone. It tells you what was burning. And when it finally clears, all that remains is the ground. Quiet now. Empty. As if nothing extraordinary ever happened there at all.